Thank you for coming to the inaugural launch of Informed Conversations, featuring these fabulous women I'm going to introduce in a minute. The idea with Informed Conversations is to expand the platform that we already provide to women experts on our website through our database of expert women, through the social media that we're doing. So Informed Conversations is another way to feature women who know stuff, who have something to share, and to amplify their voices. We're going to create a web version of this, which will be available and you can share it, and we hope you will, to ensure that the insights that we hear tonight will be further disseminated beyond the confines of this wine and cheese infused room. So, thank you all for being here. Jane Griffith is a partner at Odgers and Berndsen. She's also, I have to start with this, one of the advisory committee members of Informed Opinions. She has many years in executive search and before that in professional fundraising. She has supported clients in Canada, in the US, in Dubai. Sorry, we're not even going to get to talk about Dubai. Australia. She's a member of the steering committee for the 30% Club, which many of you will know of as a leadership advocacy for women initiative. She speaks frequently, so she's out there already. And this is also, I didn't know this about you, Jane, completed coursework for a master's in environmental studies where she focused on emotional intelligence, which I'm guessing makes you really good at executive recruit.
You think we'd have to hope that there's a parallel there, so
I'm
we'll just
thinking
leave it
there
at that.
is. I'm thinking there is. Shastri Ramnath is a mining executive. She's a professional geoscientist with 2 decades of also global experience in exploration and mining. In 2010, as the president of CEO Bridgeport Ventures, she raised over $17 million in capital markets before managing a successful merger. I didn't know that about you either, and so I think we need to do lunch. So in 2012, Shastri co-founded with Ashley Kirwan, where are you? Oryx Geoscience, a consulting firm that partners with exploration and mining companies to provide front-end geological support. What they do is so interesting to somebody with a theater degree who knows nothing about that world. And just 3 years later, Shastri and Ashley too were nominated for the RBC Women of Canadian Women Entrepreneur of the Year. You were nominated, and then you were jointly nominated for a follow-up iteration of that. And more recently, Shastri has co-founded Exiro Minerals, a junior exploration company that combines technology with traditional exploration methodologies. So we have 2 very different worlds represented here, and I know we're going to have a rich conversation about attracting and retaining female talent because it really shouldn't be that difficult. When I first met you at the Women in Mining conference a few years ago, you told the story of getting that pivotal job interview, and you attributed it to your name. Can you give us the abbreviated version of that?
The abbreviated version was that I applied for this job, and the person said, yes, absolutely, you've got the job, come on down. And I said, great, I'll be there in a few minutes. So I got in the car and I drove from the university down to this company, and I arrived and the president was sitting there and he said, oh, let me guess, you're here for the job. And I said, yes. He goes, I'm sorry, but we've just hired a gentleman and he's on his way here. And then I said, well, actually, is the gentleman's name Shastri? And he looked at the rest of us, as a matter of fact, yes. And I said, well, that's actually me. And the silence was so long and awkward. And finally, one of the gentlemen in the room said, he's just a little surprised, come on in, have a seat. I ended up working for him for 2 years, and he got me my job at Falconbridge.
And so this was a mining job, and they really had no imagination that it could possibly be a woman.
No, he was really caught off guard.
Right, right. How difficult was it for you when you first entered the mining industry in terms of thinking about the retainment piece, like women being in non-traditional environments that are not built by or for their needs?
You know, first of all, when I joined the industry, I was a bit oblivious. I didn't actually understand some of the limitations for women, and it was actually geology. I ended up in geology because it was the only course I didn't bomb in first year, so oh, I can be a geologist. So I went in and I went into geology, and when I graduated, it's interesting because I ended up, and this is kind of a personal note, but I ended up being married for 8 years to a geologist who had the same 2 degrees as myself. The first job we both got hired for a job, and he got paid $7 an hour and I got paid $6 an hour. And you know what I thought? Oh my goodness, he's so smart. That's why he got the job, right? Because he's so much smarter than me, and the job was longer, and he got to do geology, and I was told I had to cook and actually light the mosquito coil in the outhouse for the geologist in the morning and all these things, right? It was pretty crazy. But I justified it in my mind. So then him and I broke up. I moved on to, this is explaining my experience in the last 20 years. Then I spent 8 years with another gentleman, and we were together for 4 years, and then we kind of dated on and off for 4 years. But at one point, our mortgage documents got mixed because we were now separated, and now I got his mortgage document in the mail. And the reason I realized it was mixed is because I went, that's not my salary. And we had the same position, the same experience, and everything was the same, and I thought, this is ridiculous. So I went to my boss, explained. Fast forward 3 months later, after a lot of back and forth, they came back and said to me, you're right. You are absolutely right. We're really sorry. But we have a policy. We can only give 10% raises each year, and it'll take 3 years to get you to the point where you'll be equal to those people. I quit 3 months later. So fast forward, now I'm with another person who is the father of my child, who I'm going to be with forever. This is the last one. Also a geologist. So these are 3 geologists. And he is the CEO of a publicly traded company. And we had a baby about 14 months ago. And I started working right away. I love what I do. About 8 months in, we were at a conference, the same conference. And a gentleman came up to me and said, shouldn't you be parenting right now? And it just blew my mind, because do you think anybody said that to my partner? So at the end of the day, mining has been excellent. I have just worked with fabulous people.
Okay, you need different stories to lead into that.
I just wanted to share those 3 over 20 years. I was with somebody every time who was the same as me, and yet these were the things that happened. But at the end of the day, I will say that this Me Too movement and these things that are happening, I'm really pleased to see these things are happening. I will say that I was fortunate that I worked with a lot of good men over those years, and it was a man who said, we need to give you the raise, and it was always, I've always been supported. So that's my experience in mining, is that, you know, there are the downsides, but it wasn't like the entertainment industry. It was much better.
But it could be clear why you're self-employed now.
Oh, because there was a glass ceiling, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jane, as an executive recruiter, you probably have heard stories like this. Yep. You've had the ability to set your own hours now, like Shastri does as a self-employed person, manage your practice in ways that worked for you. Are you also a walking demonstration of the appeal of being a consultant or self-employed? Is there a similar story?
I mean, I'm not really self-employed. I mean, I have a CEO, and I've had CEOs in every firm that I've worked with. I believe, really, that I report to my clients. It's my clients that I do the work for. It's them that I need to be happy. My CEO makes sure that I bring in money. So it's similar, but it's not bang on. But I do have a whole lot of freedoms, because if my clients say we need you to come to this, or we want you to attend that, or this or that, I flex my schedule around those pieces. So there is a freedom there. And I'm sure, like Shastri, not easily achieved. There's been a lot of times where there's been a lot of pushback. I went back to work after my second child after 5 weeks of maternity leave. And when I was pregnant with my second child, I'm commission-based, 100% commission-based in search. So it's really important that I carry a full search load. And so when I explained, because I couldn't hide it anymore, that I was pregnant, the next day they took all my searches away from me. And they said, we're gonna give you some other work to do. And I said, I'm fine. And they said, well, you know, and I was really upset. And they said, don't be emotional. I was like, okay, I'm gonna leave and go home, because I'm gonna say something that I probably shouldn't say. And so I drove home, and they called me in the car, and I said, no, like, you honestly need to just stop talking, and we should leave. Right, just leave. And he said, well, why? What are you going to say? I said, I'm going to say that you're an idiot, and I'm going to say that I quit. And he's like, well, you said it. I'm like, right, so I'm going to hang up, and I'll see you tomorrow. So I came in the office the next day, and I said, let me just ask you some questions. And they said, okay. I said, so we have a colleague, and his wife was pregnant with their third child. So what happened as a partner to his search load? And they said, well, we gave him everything we could to get him to have more searches. And I said, okay, why? He said, well, there's another mouth to feed. He's single income. And I said, okay, so I have another mouth to feed, and I'm the primary income. So what's the difference here? And he thought, and he looked at me, and he said, oh, you think I've made a sexist decision? And I said, ding. I said, actually, I do. And he said, oh, I need to think about that. And I said, okay, great. And so I think I went out for lunch, and I came back, and I got all my searches back. But those are hard conversations to have. You're calling people on the mat, you're asking them to evaluate. And I don't believe for a second they made those decisions because they were trying to be mean to me. They were trying to do what's, they believe, right for a pregnant woman. We're going to protect you, we're going to take the stress off you. But it's not equal and it's not fair, words that we don't use in a corporate environment. But it's a systemic issue about how we see women and how we see women in a workplace.
So my next question is predicted by these responses, both of you, and that is, did becoming a parent, a mother, change how you thought about managing the workplace? Did it inspire you to ask for accommodations or changes? I mean, that's a very significant change, but not of the kind that I was imagining.
Yeah.
Because you wanted to keep as opposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I often have that role where I think I might be in reverse of some other people, right? I was willing to come back after 5 weeks. I was right, it was all these pieces. But becoming a parent has changed my perception on what's possible and what's not possible, because I see things through my children's eyes. So the story, I'll say, is about my daughter who's 11, and I work with academic clients, and I'm working with a big independent school and a girls' school, and I said to her, you know, would you ever be interested in going to a girls' school? And she said, no. Like, didn't even think about it, just no. And I said, well, why not? And she said, and she's an old soul, so, you know, she always comes up with these answers. I'm like, oh, interesting. Can you speak for me? And so she said, you know, as much as the boys annoy me in class, and as much as they're bothersome, they're funny because they get in trouble all the time. And so I think I'd miss that if I wasn't in boys' school. And I said, oh, okay. I said, do you ever think you would do better in school or could concentrate more if you weren't being distracted by these boys? And she said, no. And I said, okay. Do you ever think that you're in competition with the boys? And she said, no. And I said, okay. And she said, why, Mommy, do you compete with boys? And I said, of course I do. So let me tell you about the systemic barriers, and let me tell you about unconscious bias. I went right into it. And she looked at me and she's like, well, then you're not very confident. And I said, well, no, that's not it. And I did the whole justification thing. And she said, okay. She said, I got it. And she said, well, if that were to happen at my school, the bias would be towards the girls, because we're the ones in the class that work the hardest, we're the ones in the class that get the best grades, and we're going to be the ones that go out to get the best jobs to change the world. And I was like, oh my God, okay, fantastic, done. And so I thought, right, like, how much of this is the systemic barriers that are in place, and how much of it is us repeating the barriers that are there because it's what we know? So if the change doesn't start with us, it's not going to change. And so I said, okay, great, thanks. And then she said, did you just interview me? And I was like, yes, I did. So
we just need to make sure by the time your daughter is there, she doesn't get smacked upside the face with the reality
or if she does get smacked upside the face, that she's got a way to be able to address it and push back. That's the resilience piece that we've got to teach her. Because to believe that she won't be smacked with that, I think is foolish.
Yeah.
So it's eyes wide open, here's what's happened, and here's how you stay strong to that. Here's the resilience you take into that, and here's where you pause, and it's okay to be emotional, but you continue to fight.
Right. In the mining industry, in your earlier jobs before you were the boss, were you ever in a position where you were asking for flexible work or accommodations that were essentially a function of you being a woman in a system designed by and for men?
You know what, I was in a position where I thought about this question a lot because I was in a position where all I wanted to do was work. Like I just really loved what I did. So when it came time to ask for something, I remember my partner was in a car accident. I wanted to do my MBA. There were some things that came up that required some flexibility, and they had no problem doing it. So I was lucky that way. But I didn't have kids at that time, so I think that's where things really change in life. But I do think now, in the position that I'm in and with my business partner, Ashley, that one of the fundamental things that we believe is not everybody's the same. And this applies to men and women. Everybody has a need. Everybody has something that they want in life. The newly married couple wants to go on a 1-month honeymoon, and the new mother wants to stay home for an extra month, or the other new mother wants to come back early. Me too. So there's all these things that I think each person wants, and what drives me nuts is policy-driven procedures or things in a company. And I don't care how big it is. Ashley and I have talked about this. It doesn't matter how big the company gets. It is going to be a case-by-case basis, because you can say that a woman comes and says, my aunt died, and you can say, well, you don't get bereavement leave. You know what, if that aunt raised you, then you should have bereavement leave. So we really believe in looking at each situation separately, and this actually applies to men too.
You have a preponderance of women. I just went on your website the other day and I counted, I think, 10 women and 2 men. And this is a mining company, let's just be clear, or mining services company. How did you manage that in an industry that is desperate to find women?
Okay, so the first thing is the website's outdated because we have 60 employees now.
60?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't think
I didn't know there was that many, that was that outdated. We're trying to revamp it right now because we've grown so fast. We have about 50-50 women, men now. And how did we get there? It's so funny. We hired the best person for the job. And it happened to be mostly women most of the time. We're now at a 50-50. Because what's happening is I think we went through a stage where we hired the best people for the job. The first 10 were almost all women. And then more women started applying, but all of a sudden men who like that environment and want to be, men are not always the way we perceive men. There's a lot of men in our environment who thrive in an environment where we are sensitive and we do communicate and we are organized and all these things. So we have now come to 50-50, but it's never been by design. It's always been by hiring the best person for the job. And just to your daughter's class, that is the kind of women we have. They are just excellent. They're organized. They get things done, and they've actually attracted other high quality women to the organization.
So back to you in the recruitment business, because I'm sure you have lots of clients who recognize the imperative to have a more gender balanced workforce because of the business case for that. What are they doing wrong, and what do you advise them to do to achieve the kinds of results that Shastri and Ashley have been able to?
Yeah, the example I always give my clients when I work with them, they come to us with a mandate and they say, and by the way, we need diverse candidates. And I said, okay, so if you want to get to a point where you've got a balanced slate to choose from, or at least a not all one homogeneous group to choose from, you actually have to start when you write the job description and the advertisement. And so if you want to hire someone who has an MBA and has 15 years senior leadership experience, and ideally has an MBA from a top school, let's backdate that. So 15 years of senior leadership experience means they've been in the workforce for, let's say, 7 years. So you're looking at the graduating class of a top-ranked MBA school 22 years ago. Are you at 3% diversity? Are you at 5% diversity? Let's call it 10% diversity. That means if every single diverse candidate that fit that criteria applied, at the end you would have 1 out of 10. If you change the wording to, we need someone with 15 years experience and an MBA from a top, all of a sudden you've completely changed the playing field. So I do a lot of work on the use of language, and if we don't look at and really examine the words that we're using and the context that it creates, you'll never get to a place of even setting the bar so that you can get a mixed group in. So I talk to them a lot about language. I talk to them about unconscious bias and what that looks like. Like, what happens if you have a candidate and you can't pronounce the name, or what happens if you have a candidate and you assume the wrong gender? All of the pieces that go around with that. What if you have a candidate, and I work with academic institutions where part of the hiring process is to take that person out for dinner. And you ask that candidate, do you need to go look at schools for your kids? You've breached the Human Rights Code.
just asking the question that on the surface seems...
Because if you say no, and there's a perception that you've made a decision because they have kids, you can take that to the Human Rights Tribunal. If you ask if your spouse needs employment and they say yes or no, you're going into charter territory again that is protective grounds. If you ask if they need to know about local churches or local synagogues or local whatever, you're breaching the grounds. And it's not that they have wrong intentions, they're trying to be welcoming, but you can't incorporate these pieces. So I remind the committee constantly that the pieces that you can judge a candidate are only the pieces that are in the job description. And that's what we have to hold to. So what is a must-have and what's a need-to-have? And then we have to look at it differently.
And are they receptive to that? Are job descriptions being changed as a result of...
Yeah, I really believe they are. And it's a double-edged sword because it's not just that the job description has to change, the recruiters have to change. We know that when you get a woman on the phone, she will say,
I'm not the best person.
I'm not the best person. And if the recruiter doesn't change that conversation, it's okay, thanks, bye, click, and you're ruling them out of the mix. So you need to have a different type of conversation with female candidates and a different type of conversation with male candidates who will say, I'm an expert, right? Okay, in one piece or two pieces you might be, but talk to me about these other 8. So if you don't flip the conversation, you're not going to have a balanced slate. So it's on both sides. It's on client side and it's on our side as recruiters as well.
Do you come across in recruiting, or you said something earlier to me about the confidence piece and women in your organization, men in your organization, do you notice a difference?
Oh yeah, well, there's 100% a difference, and it's greater the earlier they are on in their careers. The later you get, women get a little more confidence, and they're just a little bit different. They're still they're still at the top. There's still differences, but I remember early on. So confidence for sure. I think one of the greatest things we can give a young geologist is our time. Or a young, somebody else who's coming in the different parts of our company. And the best thing we can do is sit down and give them time. And I had this one geologist, we were in a field camp and we were sitting there chatting, we were having dinner at night, and I said, well, you're an excellent geologist. And I was eating, and she just paused and she looked up at me and she went, you think I'm a good geologist? I'm like, you're a fantastic geologist. She's like, no, I never thought I was. I'm like, what do you mean you never thought you were? She says, well, I don't know what I'm doing. And she went through all these things. I was so disappointed. And I said to her, I cleared it up right away. And I exactly told her why she was a good geologist. You're organized, you understand drill hole databases, you're getting into 3D modeling, you're understanding how to interpret. And the next day, another female colleague came to me and said, do you know how good you made her feel that she actually realized she's a good geologist? It actually makes me sad to think she felt that way. And then I fast forward to myself and in my career. So like I said earlier, my partner's a CEO of a company, and you're going to make me come to a class just to solve this issue. He introduces himself as the CEO of Transition Metals. I introduce myself as Shastri Ramnath.
Shastri, you already took that workshop.
I still can't do it. I still can't go in and go, I'm the co-founder and I'm the former CEO because we've started a new company. But I struggle with that because I feel like there's an element of bragging all the time. I'm still working on it. I'll get there. But I'm just making the point that that's an example for me at my level, still having confidence issues because I feel like it's a bragging because we've been really successful. And I don't really feel like bragging about it because I feel like I don't like when guys do that. Yet I don't judge when somebody comes in and goes, oh, I'm the CEO of such and such company. So I'm still working on that. But my point is about the confidence barrier. I think that's number one all through for different reasons.
So tip on just practice saying it in the bathroom, in the car when nobody can hear you. Really, literally, if you say it often enough, the words will start to feel more natural, and then you'll be able to do it when it counts. I'm totally distracted from my questions. Jane, you also told me an anecdote recently. I hope I'm not speaking out of school because I have no idea who the client was.
No, you're in the room. Yeah, no.
Oh. About a client seeking diverse applicants, and their entire hiring committee was all men, but they really wanted women, and that disconnect had never occurred to them before you pointed it out.
Yeah, pin-dropping silence. So, I mean, a formative moment in my career where I'm in front of this really big panel. It's a CEO search, and we've done the whole launch, and we've won the search, and all great. And the chair turned to me and said, Jane, before we end the meeting, is there anything else we need to discuss? And I had that like, I'm going to do this. And I said, actually, there is. And he said, okay, right. And so I had their attention. And I said, there will be a point in time in the search process where I let the candidates know who is on the search committee. And someone will say to me, why is it an all-male committee? And they went like this.
They had to check.
Huh! Like it had never occurred to them. And so that in itself was a little bit appalling. And then it just became humorous because then I sat through 5 minutes of conversation of somebody suggesting one person and somebody suggesting the other person, only to find out that it was the same woman who had a short form name. And I was like, honestly, guys, like.
They could only think of one.
They could only, because I think there might have really only been two women on the board, but they both wanted this one person, but she had a short form, right? So and I mean, great group, but again, I go back to this, because we know what boards are, right? Boards are, you want a homogeneous group that's going to make a decision, and it's not going to be stressful. Sure, you might be getting paid to be on the board, but it's a nominal fee. So you're not looking really for diversity of opinion and diversity of thought. We're looking for groupthink, and let's make the decision and increase the share value. And so the idea that I put them in a situation where they had to think differently was an awkward moment, and I'm glad I did. And they ended up hiring a female candidate. Might they have hired that candidate anyways if there wasn't a woman on the group? Sure. But are they hopefully going to look at different panels differently? I hope so.
Shastri, you wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail a couple of years ago talking about retention specifically, and you maybe you can give us some reminder examples about the strategies that you use. I mean, it's not enough to hire the right people or the diverse people, but then women, we know, are leaving in droves from all sorts of industries because the fit or the comfort level is so not there. So
Okay. So, yeah, we published an article, and it was basically around things like we conduct stay interviews or surveys to see what the employees actually what they really value. We talk about being as generous as we can with the employees. With this one policy mistake that I talked about earlier, we make sure that we talk to women, we talk to men, we find out what's important to them. Shared cost training, so when they come, and actually with women too, one of the things we've started doing is actually suggesting to them they should consider an MBA. You know, a lot of times you wait for somebody to come to you and you see somebody with talent and you go, have you thought about doing an MSc? And they, oh yeah, well yeah, I kind of thought about it. Another one was MBA. Yeah, I'd really like to do it. And you start asking those questions and you realize they want to do it, but they just didn't have the confidence to even cross the line to try. So we started doing shared cost where we pay for things or they pay for half, and then we take it off their paycheck over periods of time. And one of the other things was leadership. We try and do leadership retreats, so we focus on soft skills with the whole company. But I've had some new thoughts since then about retainment. Okay. And one of the experiences we've had is if you hire I'm going to actually pose this as a question. The high quality people, the people who do really well at their roles in an organization, when they leave, how would you compare replacing them in terms of difficulty with somebody who was a poor performer, didn't do their job well, created a mess, and then they've usually been escorted out the door? Which one do you think is harder to replace? Most people will say that the high performer, right? It's not. The reality is, you got to get somebody in who's a high performer to clean up the mess that this person left. The high performers, when they leave, everything is, you bring somebody else in, they come in who's also a high performer, they pick up where they left off. And so what we found in terms of retaining, one of the things we want to do is that we've accepted that a certain portion of the workforce is going to leave. Their husband moves somewhere, or they decide that they want to travel the world for a year, or they want to go spend more time with their parents. So there's other reasons for leaving an organization. They want to get further educated, but do it full time. And so what we've realized with retaining, that it's more important to focus on getting the right people into the organization, because they themselves will keep other people in the organization. But they're easier to replace if they do decide to leave. So that's a later observation we came
that's
to.
so interesting. I'm wondering about the visibility of women. So further to your experience with this panel that was all male. One of the cases we try to make with corporations when we're recruiting new experts for our database is to say, if you want to demonstrate to the world that your company is walking the talk, that diversity is important to you, that you really want and are a good place for women to work, you need to have some of those women visible so that other women think, oh, okay, I could actually picture myself there because I see other women. Is that something that comes up in the searches you're doing?
Yeah, it does, but there's this likability gap, right? And there's Sheryl Sandberg spoke about it, a lot of people speak about it. When women become more successful, they become less liked. When men become more successful, they're seen in a better spotlight as leadership material. Yeah. So again, back to this language this piece, I spent a lot of time talking about the difference between role modeling and normalizing. So the definition for role modeling is someone that should be looked to or as a model.
Right.
Normalizing means it's normal. So if we put women in roles where we just want them to be role models, we're saying, look, it's unusual to have a female CEO. Look, it's unusual to have a woman quoted in an op-ed. Look, it's unusual to have a female on a board of directors. I believe that's the wrong message, and I don't think that's what we're trying to say. I think what we're trying to do is normalize that behavior. So listen, we've hired the best candidate. She's our new CFO, CIO, CTO, manager of this, manager, and she happens to be female. If we don't change the lens by which we're going to do that, then women aren't going to be prone to do that because they're going to know I'm going to become successful and I'm not going to be liked. And there's lots of research around that.
And so how do you do that?
So I try and take the emphasis off the gender piece. I try and focus on skills and attributes and experience, and to get women to understand that they're in a process not because they're female and they're rounding out the slate, but because they have the skills to be there.
You talked earlier to me about you talked about the language of the job ads, but also performance evaluations obviously play a role in that as well, because if we're evaluating women on gendered terms, that shows up and makes a difference to advancement.
It's a huge, we deal with it. So there's been multiple articles in HBR, one that had a really small study group that talked about a word that's never used in male reviews but always used in female reviews, and it's this whole idea around being abrasive. Men are never abrasive, but women are abrasive, right? It's personal criteria that they get. But there was, and it's on my Twitter feed if you want to take a look, and I've got a copy of it. This actually is a result that came from a survey where they looked at 90,000, so a huge pool, performance reviews in the American military. And they looked at language. And so you've got positive words for males, positive words for females. Negative words for males, negative words for females. But it's not just a pure numbers game. So what the article said, and it's a really important point, is that the first positive word that they use for men is analytical. The first positive word that they use for females is compassionate. So if you're faced with a business decision, who do we promote? Who do we have to let go? The choice between analytical or compassionate is vastly different. And so those are the positive words, and they have an impact. The negative words are really scary. Men are arrogant and irresponsible. Women are inept, selfish, frivolous, passive, scattered, opportunistic, gossips, excitable, vain, panicky, temperamental, my personal favorite, and indecisive.
That sounds like men, by the way.
Right, I know. I'm like, you're projecting. But it's back to this whole idea around language, and what we are telling women is the best that you can possibly be in a job is to be compassionate about your role.
And the solution is?
The more I look at this, the more I research this, the more I understand the significance and the impact of language. what we say, how we say it, what we write, whether it's speaking to each other, speaking to our children, speaking to our spouses, to our workplace. We have to start seeing people in their roles based on their skills, not on their gender or their diversity complement or whatever that piece, or, oh my goodness, a visible minority and a female, or a visible minority with a disability. We have to stop focusing on that. And if we stop focusing on that, I do not believe that we're going to go back to all men. I think we are way past that, but we have to focus on the skill sets.
So from a practical standpoint, in terms of how an organization would implement, I mean, because that's talking about, as with the role models versus normalization, that's a process that requires years of people. I mean, normalization comes from quantities of people in the role. And so from a practical standpoint, what might companies do, and maybe this is something that you deal with as well, to, like, do you create a template when you're doing performance evaluations so that you're using words that are already there and measuring against skills as opposed to making it subjective in the way that clearly the inclusion of those words is projection, so subjective.
And we're getting there. It's already happening. So this is where AI is coming in, and here are some real benefits around it. So there's a website called Texio.
Texio?
Texio, T-E-X-I-O, or it's T-E-X-T-I-O. And so you can take a paragraph, you can take multiple paragraphs, you can dump it into Textio, and it will pull out for you the male-dominated words and the female-dominated words. So if you have a job description, if you've got an advertisement, it will say you're going to get more males that will attract to this role or more females that will be attracted to this role. And you can balance that off. So there's people that are cracking this code already, and the next generation of millennials are not going to accept, as we don't accept from our forebears, a status quo.
So I'm going to open it up to questions in a minute, and while you're thinking of your questions, because this is an event by Informed Opinions which promotes women speaking up, you will all have questions. Now I've forgotten the question I wanted to follow up with that.
It was around the millennials.
It was around the millennials, thank you. This is the beauty of having prepped your audience in advance. And so I'm interested in both of you because you've got lots of millennials in your, mostly millennials in your organization. Is that something that you notice a difference generationally, or maybe maybe all of your employees are millennials?
They're
and so,
almost all, yeah.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I think millennials have it right. I think this idea that millennials are so in terms of equality, that's where mostly it's 50-50. And I can tell you, like, just as much as I needed the baby crib at work, Justin needed it too, and so did Ali. So it's not, we have a crib at work because the men also bring their kids in. So it's a really different generation to deal with. And the way we look at it is the days of working for a jerk with people you don't like in a job for 30 years to get a pension are over. The millennials have it right. They want to enjoy their vacations. They want to like the people they work for. They want to respect the company that they go to every day. And they want to have meaningful work. So we actually think the millennials have it right. And when people go off about them, I actually get super irritated. I'm right on the boundary. I think it's around the late 70s that it switches into millennials. And I do think they have it right. And I think that with millennials, we will see a shift to more not just diversity in terms of female and male, but more tolerance for ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation. I think that's all coming, but it'll take some time.
So my final question to you about the millennials is, do you think that this influx of millennials in the workplace who have expectations around flexibility, want to spend time with their families, take vacations, will that help women generally? Is there a correlation to be made there?
I'm going to say yes because I'm an optimist. What we see from millennials is they influence the culture of an organization. And if they can't influence the culture of the organization, they leave. And they start their own where that has that culture. And that culture is one where things are even, level. They don't see gender like we see gender. They don't see sexual orientation, right? That whole list, any of the diversity, they don't see it the way we do. So, you know, the list you just said, you know, they want to have work-life balance. They want to spend time with their, you know, I'm just like, like, God, would I have asked for any of that when I was in my 20s? Like, I have to leave early today because No. So good for them. And let's empower that. It doesn't mean that if you're a white male and you're 60 and that's not a priority, that's wrong. It just means it's different. So influence the culture. If the culture doesn't work, if the culture can't change, it's not the right place for you, and you go somewhere else or you start it. They have this incredible power of starting companies and a can-do attitude of, if it doesn't work for me, I'm just going to do it myself. And that's the future.
And that future sounds like normalization, which is what you were talking about. I mean, that shift is happening and that normalization is happening. Okay, your turn. Comments, observations, personal experiences, things that you were really hoping we would cover given the title. Yes, thank you.
When we're discussing different candidates, a lot of the times our casers are males, for example, and they're bringing up things as, oh, well, you know, she was a bit more soft-spoken than X male. And so how do you recommend that I redirect the subject, not the subject, the conversation towards, like, are you saying this because she's a female, or are you saying this because this is actually kind of, you think she would be good in this role?
Yeah, to me that goes to the word that I try and eradicate out of every document, which is fit, right? Fit means, is she like us? And so what I tell committees is I don't use fit, I use alignment. And what I ask them to consider is, where is this person adding skills that we don't have? If you're, and so I call them out on it now. Have been in it for more than 2.5 years, but if you're all full of opinions and loud, maybe it's not such a bad thing to have an introvert at the table. That might complement the group. So if you can get to the point where you feel comfortable saying, hold on, let's spin this and see it from a different side. Let's see what they contribute to the organization instead of just continuing, you might get some wiggle room there.
Anne, thank you so much.
Thank you. So as we look at things from a women's or a feminist point of view, the question I'd like to hear you talk about is, there are other groups that don't get their fair share of the pie, and that can be based on sexual orientation, that can be based on race, that can be based on cultural background. Like, there's a lot of pieces. So we've talked a lot about women, but I'd like to hear your thoughts about some of the other folks that are kind of often standing outside the door with us, and what our role is in that.
Can I comment on that? So I was telling Shari earlier that I have a stepson. I have a really unique family where I have a 25-year-old stepson and a 22-year-old stepdaughter, and they're both super successful, and then the 1-year-old. So it's interesting. The 25-year-old, he has a partner, and this partner gave our son this weekend a book called Pink is for Boys. And he opened up to me, and I'm on this big rant right now about how we raise sons. So you were talking about your daughter. I think part of the problems are how we raise boys. And so I've been, I kind of think I wanted a girl, but now that I have a son, I'm looking forward to raising him to be a good young man. Anyway, to your point, I talked to my son-in-law, and I think that he came out when he was a teenager, and it was incredibly hard for him. And imagine being, I think he's not effeminate at all, but I think inside he's a compassionate person. And I feel really that we, after women really, as the pendulum is swinging, which we all know it is right now, there's a big swing going on. I think there's going to be other groups that are going to follow, and I think women are really going to help enter that group of people.
I have a friend who calls herself the chief follow me executive. And so she says she takes a step forward, she gets there, she gains credibility, and she turns around and she says, it's safe, come on. and I think that's part of our job. We're in a privileged position of having the strength of Me Too and Time's Up behind us right now. We've got to use that to open the door. We know what it feels like to not be treated equally. We can't get in a position where we become like others and get comfortable in that.
The other thing I notice is that it's harder if you're a member of a marginalized group to be advocating for the marginalized group. So for women to advocate, for a white woman to advocate, for racialized women, for straight people to advocate and call out and challenge circumstances that are clearly marginalizing transgender or gay and lesbians. I'm wondering, as a racialized woman in Canada, did you ever encounter situations where you felt that the way people were responding to you or not wanting to hire you or was ever a function of that?
Well, I do think, first of all, my name, if it came across in a resume, it'd probably get pushed aside. So I always got a job through people I knew. I also had, in that company I ran, when I came in for the interview, he said, "Oh my goodness, it's perfect. You're Indian and you're a woman." He said that. He goes, "This is perfect." And so, yeah, it's like, check, check. You know what, I feel that now I just ignore it. You know, we do only business with people, Ashley and I, we've chosen to do business with people who actually respect us. And so we've kind of eliminated that, even though it's there, and we kind of ignore it. But yeah, you know, you feel it, but for the most part, people who are really blatant about it, we don't do business with.
Other comments or questions? Yes.
I'd love to build on that question. I think that's really insightful around how do different groups experience inclusion. And so I run a tech startup, and so we're using AI to help companies develop diversity and inclusion strategy. So we have the data, it's just nobody is analyzing it and using it in a way that helps give companies a data-driven selection programs to implement. And so we just completed a pilot of 20 companies from the US, Canada, and the UK. Over 2,000 employees were surveyed. And we asked them about different KPIs, so things like flexibility at work, bias and feedback and reviews, and inclusive culture. One thing that we just did our LGBTQ2+ deep dive in honor of Pride, and one thing that really stood out to me is actually thanks to Brent's suggestion. One question we asked was, what does your company do well to promote inclusion and belonging at your workplace? And one of the most commonly cited answers from the LGBT community was, and I was actually fascinated, when the CEO sent an email to the employee base celebrating a religious holiday. And most of these respondents did not identify with the religion that was being celebrated. And so one thing that signaled to me is if you stand up for inclusion, and if you role model inclusion of all cultures, even if you don't identify with that specific, that sends a strong signal that you are included even though you don't look like the majority. So I just thought it was an interesting, maybe one way that companies can start to tackle that question of, you know, it's not just a women's issue, it's an inclusion issue.
And it does come from leadership, for sure.
Yeah.
If the leaders believe and behave a certain way, it's all through the organization. That's one thing we've learned. I didn't believe that early in my career, and I learned it when a CEO quit, and the next day the organization changed. So we believe in really in being vocal about what we believe. Yeah.
And I believe we've got to move from a point of from diversity to inclusion. We've all gotten really good at measuring the statistics, right? We've got this many of this many of that, this many, right? Like you divide your Smarties into the different, like we know how to, okay, great. Now what? If we don't get to a point of inclusion and saying, you know, we're going to celebrate these holidays, we're going to put flags up and support people for Pride Month, or hey, there's a Pride Month, newsflash, that's where the rubber hits the road. It's not in the measurement, it's in the ensuring that people feel included in their workplace or their livelihoods, and that there's value there.
Can I just add to this on another topic? There's, I think about women who have children. We work in a very career-driven environment. And one of the things it's not really inclusion, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot, is that a lot of women might not have the confidence to actually have children later in life because they're so full-blown career. I remember my dad saying to me, "I don't think you should have kids because you're a career woman." And I remember that moment going, what is he talking about? And I think one of the things we can do as leaders is we can actually make it so that women are comfortable and they can decide to have children. Because I think it takes a lot of confidence to have children when you're a career person and you're perceived that way and your life is a certain way, and all of a sudden now you want to do this. I think it takes a lot of confidence to make that decision. So just as in similarly to other things, I think that leaders need to lead that it's okay to have kids and still be a career person, especially women.
And you can be. You can have kids and be a...
And that's one of the things we want to illustrate to people, is because in mining, that's not the way it was.
Jennifer.
I just picking up on that point, I love this conversation. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts specifically about starting to create a new paradigm. At CIBC, where I work, we are starting to invest in looking at this very differently. And one of the things we're doing now with Deloitte and with the Gender and the Economy Institute is we're embarking on some original research on something called the redesign of the everyday man. And so the concept that a big part of what's in our way is the incredibly confining nature of masculinity. And so I'm just interested in your thoughts, and women participate in that confinement as equally as men. And we've been focused on women for 40 years, and interested in your thoughts about that shift to men.
Personally, I think it's a critical shift. I mean, I'm not managing the kind of workforce or recruiting, but it's very clear in the work that Informed Opinions does that if we're not having conversations with men about all of these issues, whether it's flexible accommodation in workplaces or equality, treatment, voice, presence, the ability to contribute our insights and have policies and programs reflecting our realities. If men are not involved in that conversation, it's actually not a conversation. It's a movement that is going to come up against the brick wall of resistance. And so I salute CIBC for engaging in that, and it looks like others have comments as well. Go ahead.
There's so many shifts, right? There's so many shifts that have to happen. I get worried that in this conversation about gender parity and women's rights, that what's happening is that we're making men out to be the enemy. You've been entitled, you've been privileged. And now I have multiple times that white men come up to me and say, my career's over. You're wrecking my career. I will never get a job now. And that's not, I don't think, what anybody in this room is trying to do. And so if we don't include them in the conversation and the solution, we are creating another marginalized group. And that's not what we're looking to do. So somehow, some way, we've got to get them to understand that, yeah, maybe you had a position of power at one point in time, and we're not trying to take that from you. And so entitlement does not mean that now you have to be disenfranchised. Help us level that playing field.
But I think what Jennifer was referring is the effects of toxic masculinity on, and women contribute to that just as much as men. So for example, when a man asks to be a parent and take some time off, he's met with a lot of resistance and bias in the workplace, the same as women do in different ways for being a parent, or they need to not emote or to not be sensitive. And so we have to, if we're going to achieve it, we need to recognize that men suffer from the same pigeonholes that sometimes women are put in. So you must be a certain way to be a CEO. Well, a lot of men aren't that way, and so they're suffering from that too. And it's a leap for me. It took me a long time to have any sensitivity for white males. It took a lot of training and unconscious bias to realize how huge my chip was. But when I have a son and you're raising a sensitive boy and you see these labels being put down on him, like, is he gay, or he, all these things, you're like, no, he's just a good person. But he has to constantly navigate that world, and you think, oh, that's just as heavy a load as sometimes certain things that women are experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we put the confines, and we build the confines, right? Like, what's a good CEO? It's a strong male in a blue suit with a white shirt, who's tall and who's athletic and who's dependable and has a good wife and has kids. Okay. So when you don't fit that, what happens?
Sarah. Sarah, I'm CEO of a company, I'm just kidding, that's not my title.
Oh. I'm like, good for you! Shastri, see how it's done?
I'm the director of my company, it's a small company, but and I am
Don't qualify it.
Sure. Now I've got my question. Oh yeah, so I'm interested in what you're talking about in terms of toxic masculinity, both because I am raising two boys, but also because part of what we do is gender inclusive communication, and I'm doing research right now in the tech sector, particularly in startups, where my experience has not been that millennials are all that as gender inclusive as what you're describing, and that when you're looking at tech startups, there's the bro culture is really alive and well. And so what they're struggling with, and what I'm still trying to learn more about, is both recruiting more women and also where does where does that toxic masculinity in the culture? How do you have those kind of conversations in those organizations about what is going on? Because I think there's a willingness from that younger generation to have those conversations, but I think the behaviors that is happening in those companies are from the foosball on up is not inclusive of women at all. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know.
Yeah, and so this is the answer I should have given you. This is the power of being a parent, right? Like I have a son and a daughter, and I have learned as I've raised my kids that I have, that is right? I got the eyeballs first of all, I got the mom look, and then I've got the courage now to call them out and be like, that's unacceptable. Well, I remember when I first had a child, and I had to call them, and I was like, "Ooh, okay." My daughter's 11, turning 12. I got it now, right? Like I can cast through that look, and I can say unacceptable. And I find I have to muster that strength to take it in my workplace, and I've called out my colleagues on things all the time. I'm loved at my work, right? Because I'm like, no, you can't do that. It's not right, it's not fair, it's not just, it's not the values that we should be living. And I honestly believe that the men and the women, I don't believe that the majority of people are doing it to be exclusive. Yeah. They just don't know. It's like my male committee, they just didn't think of it. And we need the courage to say, not cool. It's gotta change. And then if you call them out on it, it doesn't happen, then there's got to be substantive action behind that to reinforce that, and that's got to come from the CEO in terms of the change of culture inside the organization. But we've got to be brave. I think Me Too, the lesson I take from it is you've got to be brave, and there's going to be some sacrificial lambs, right, who are the first ones, the leaders, who step up and get knocked down, and it's horrible, and then we follow, and then we gain the strength. And I think we need to tell them, no, it's not fine, and this is why, and it's got to be inclusive. And I think they'll get it, but every generation is going to have the split, right? There's going to be people who are very inclusive, there's going to be some who are on the opposite scale, and there's going to be a middle ground. I just hope the amounts, the dividends in each are sliding more across, but I think it's got to be called out.
And I think now's the time to start speaking, like to really speak up, because they're not allowed. If they go, they sweep it aside, they're going to get judged. Yeah. Because right now, what's going on in the world. And by the way, that person who said to me, shouldn't you be parenting, was a millennial. So it is still there, but I'm really proud to say that we were very careful in how we pick people for that reason, but it is there, and that's why we have to raise our boys that's where the change is going to come. We've taught girls that their favorite color can be blue, and that they can do whatever they want, but boys still have to have, they can't have pink as their favorite color. So I think that's where we got to start.
And leadership clearly matters, because the description that Sarah gave of the tech bro culture, there are probably lots of mining companies where there's a bro culture, and that's not but the leadership that you and Ashley provide, and the flexible accommodations and the talent retention strategies that you are normalizing, to use Jane's concept, clearly makes a difference in your organization. Thank you for coming to the inaugural launch of Informed Conversations. We are working to bridge the gender gap in Canadian media by 2025. That's actually the long view. We're thinking and believing that we can do it faster. And what I mean by that is, on many of your seats there was a card. The ratio of experts, sources who are quoted in Canadian media is still only about 29 or 30%. We are training and motivating women to speak up, to share their knowledge through media. We've trained more than 2,000 women. Hundreds and hundreds of those women, these two included, have subsequently written and published commentary in the Globe and Mail and in many other publications, and now Shastri, you've been quoted in the Globe 2 or 3 times since her op-ed. So we teach women to position themselves as experts, to proactively have a platform, demonstrate that they have informed opinions. Thank you.